Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see a standing room crowd. I know why that is, and it's not to hear my remarks. I'm Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute. What an honor it is and what a delight to welcome you all to this event featuring Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Leader McConnell has spoken at AEI many times on many policy subjects, but tonight's event is a little bit different. He's here to talk about his fabulous new book, The Long Game, a book about his life and his incredible career. We have copies of the book. We're going to have a signing afterward. First, we're going to hear about the book, which you're going to find fascinating. I love the book, and you're going to love it too. He talks about a behind-the-scenes look at what it's like to be the head of the Senate, but also his growing up and how it led him to where he is today. He'll be interviewed today by an old friend of mine, Matt Lewis. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he has a new book out as well that I recommend very highly to your attention, Too Dumb to Fail: How the GOP Betrayed the Reagan Revolution to Win Elections and How It Can Reclaim Its Conservative Roots. I'm not going to go on and on. I'm turning it over right now to my friend Matt Lewis and my friend Mitch McConnell.
All right. All right, thanks, Arthur, and thank you, Senator McConnell, for being here. I love the book. A lot of people probably don't know about when you were young, you actually got polio. Your dad was off fighting the Germans. And this, I think, really shaped you. And if you would talk about that and talk about your mom, who I think was very heroic in helping raise you.
Yeah, I mean, here was the situation. As you indicated, Matt, Dad was overseas in Europe. Mom was at home. She actually moved in with our sister in a little crossroads in Alabama. There wasn't even a stop sign there. People didn't even slow down when they went through. And the way polio worked, you thought you had the flu. And then when the flu went away, you could have all kinds of problems, from dying to being in an iron lung to having something less. It affected my left quadricep, which is between your knee and your hip. Obviously, I didn't bounce back like they had hoped, so fortunately, we were within 60 miles of Warm Springs, Georgia, where President Roosevelt had set up a polio treatment center, and a lot of people who worked and knew a lot about physical therapy. My mother went over there. They taught her a regimen to administer to my leg 4 times a day, they said, and don't let him walk. If any of you have had 2-year-olds, they were afraid that if I tried to walk too soon, the muscle wouldn't recover as much as they hoped it was going to, and I'd be in a brace the rest of my life. So she literally watched me like a hawk every waking moment for 2 years. And my first memory in life was the last visit to Warm Springs, where the nurses told my mother they thought I was going to be okay without a brace and without a limp. And we stopped in a shoe store on the way home and bought a pair of low-top shoes. And the reason I started the book with that story is because I think, who knows how much of an impact the things that occur to us really early in life have on us, but it was an example of extraordinary discipline, sticking to a game plan, and getting the outcome you wanted to get. And I think for most of us who are not overnight sensations, which is true of most of us, that's really the key to success, no matter what particular line of work you go into.
Yeah, and it would be obviously easy to draw a parallel to your Senate career as you do. But there was another thing you talk about in the book that I think also might speak to the challenges that you've had to overcome. And there was a guy named Dickie McGrew. Who was Dickie McGrew?
Perfect name, right?
Dickie
McGrew, I was about 7. Dickie McGrew was the guy across the street who was bigger and older than I was, and he was a bully. And he was always pushing me around. And my dad was outside one day in the yard, and he had watched this for a period of weeks. And he called me over, and he said, "Son, I want you to go over there, and I want you to beat Dickie up." I said, "Dad, he's older than I am, and he's bigger than I am." And my dad said, "I'm older than he is and bigger than he is." Given that Hobson's choice, I screwed up my courage without much hope of success, went across the street and started swinging. To my amazement, I took him down, I bent his glasses, and we never had another problem. And so that was an important lesson too, particularly if you went into my line of work, where frequently they're coming after you. And another formative moment. Well, one other thing you might enjoy a few years after that, I had applied my mother's discipline to try to get good at baseball. And I finally, after a lot of work, got better, and I was beginning to feel a little full of myself until we went in to play the City All-Stars. And I noticed they were bigger than we were. They had better uniforms, a better field. And unfortunately, I was going to pitch the second half of the game, so I had to sit there and watch how much better they were than us for half the game. My knees were literally knocking by the time I went out there. I walked the bases loaded. I walked a runner across, and I said, I'm going to get the ball over. I am going to get the ball over. I did. Home run. I figured I ought to go into another line of work.
You also moved around a lot as a child. That can be traumatic. You like me, you were an only child, and you were also shy. And that's something I think that, people are interested in. You go into politics, you're on TV, and you're shy. How have you had to deal with that disposition as a U.S. Senator? Well,
I've had a lot of practice at getting over being too shy. In the beginning, it was a challenge, but I don't think it was insurmountable. I finally got more confidence and got more used to it. And of course, the other thing in politics is, there are almost daily humiliations. You have to you get accustomed to taking a punch because you're going to get plenty of them. And the higher up you go, the more of a target you are. And so I run into people all the time and say, I don't think I would like that. How do you put up with that? And I think the key to that is deciding whose judgment you care about and dismiss the rest of it. And that's how you get your positive reinforcement, by just looking to those that you admire and seeing what they think of how you're doing.
Well, who were some of your role models or heroes that you looked to at this time?
Well, in my early life, it was a fellow named John Sherman Cooper, who was a senator from Kentucky, who was very much involved in breaking the filibuster of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. I was an intern in his office, the only intern, in the mailroom. And even though I think Kentucky overall was probably pro-Civil Rights Bill of 64, as you can imagine, the people who were writing were very much not in that camp. And I didn't get to see him a lot. I was a lowly intern, but I do remember asking him about all that. And he said he thought it was very important on issues of national significance to do what you thought was best, even if your constituents may not share that view at a particular time, which I really admired. And that was, of course, the era of that was the issue of my generation, right? The Civil Rights Bill of 64 and 65.
And you voted against Barry Goldwater.
I did,
for Lyndon Johnson in 1964.
Yeah. And to show you what a tough vote that was for me, I had gotten lucky, and Goldwater had come to the University of Louisville campus 2 years before that, and I'd gotten to introduce him as head of the College Republican. So I was a big Goldwater enthusiast. But I was so angry with him over his decision to oppose the Civil Rights Bill of 64, because I thought, even at that age, and it's proven to be true, that was going to completely redefine our ability to appeal to African American voters for the foreseeable future, and it still has, going down to today. Subsequently, I didn't feel very good about that vote because almost everything else about Goldwater I liked, and I felt badly that in retrospect, looking what Johnson did to the country in his second term, that I had voted that way. But I was really angry. It was a protest,
right.
A protest vote.
So I think I have to ask you this question now in light of that.
I know where you're headed.
So you voted against Barry Goldwater in 1964 because he opposed the Civil Rights Act. You voted against President Reagan's, or voted to break his veto on apartheid in the 1980s. And it's no secret that many members of your chamber have voiced grave concerns about Donald Trump's recent statements. Is there a threat? Is there a danger that your legacy on civil rights, that this could become, untenable for you to continue to support him?
Yeah, I've been out the last week on a book tour, and as you can imagine, I've been dealing with this on a daily basis. And yeah, I worry about these gratuitous shots at a variety of different Americans. In particular, the parallel I think you're looking for is basically writing off Hispanic Americans. Even if you thought that was appropriate in any way, which I don't, just from a practical point of view, when Reagan was elected in 1980, 84% of Americans were white. This November, 70% will be. So even if you were not motivated by the inappropriateness of singling out citizens based upon their heritage and attacking them, it's stupid to do that. I mean, it's not smart. And one of the things I think you and I have in common, I'm not into doing dumb things, you know? Like shutting down the government, you know? People hate it. And the notion that you're going to do something like that, no matter how you characterize why you're doing it, and not turn off a lot of people, is just not smart. I mean, there's nothing that requires you in politics to do dumb things, and I'm not in favor of doing dumb things.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that. On the other hand, there are legitimate concerns. You know, Donald Trump, I think, ended up winning. You know, if you take the people who voted for, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and Ben Carson, and you add all of them up, something like 70% of the Republican base voted for an outsider or kind of an anti-establishment candidate. And like you, I'm very concerned about issues like tax reform and entitlement reform. I think these are really important, and you talk a lot about them in the book, and you've been a champion of these issues. But what could the Senate do that might resonate with those Republican base voters who don't care about, they don't appreciate the importance, say, of entitlement reform? What can a Senate do for them?
Well, I think, for one thing, a lot of base voters have been really misled by a lot of talk show hosts and others about what's achievable when you don't have the White House. There's a lot of discussion about the Constitution, and yet people don't seem to know anything about it. For example, there is a president. The only one of 330 some odd million of us who can sign something into law or veto a bill. The notion, for example, that shutting down the government to defund Obamacare, even if that would achieve the result, and by the way, Obamacare is an entitlement, so you could shut down the government, which is the discretionary accounts, had no impact on Obamacare. But let's assume it would. The idea that Obama of Obamacare would sign such a bill is what my friend George Will calls the politics of futile gesture, or put another way, doing dumb things. And I'm not in favor of futile gestures and doing dumb things. I think the reason people are unhappy is because of the condition of the country, and because they've been fed the notion that somehow a Republican Congress can overcome a Democratic president and completely bring him to his knees when it's not possible. One thing we have done as we got control of the Senate is demonstrate that by putting the repeal of Obamacare on his desk. We put the Waters of the United States on his desk. We put the Keystone Pipeline on his desk. But all of those who enjoy being in a circular firing squad will not even pay any attention to the fact that on a number of these key issues, we've gone as far as we can go without having somebody who will sign the measure that you put on his desk.
And you talk in the book about how President Obama, as smart as he is, maybe isn't always the best person to negotiate with.
He's like the kid, in your class who was a really smart guy but wanted to make sure you knew that. And one of the president's grating characteristics, in my view, is characterizing my views to me in a meeting. It's really a waste of time. We have had, I think, a few opportunities to have constructive negotiations, but it was not with him. It was with the vice president, who didn't waste any time trying to convince me of things he knew I couldn't be convinced of, nor did I with him. president does deserve credit for designating him. And those were occasions where we had to act. Either taxes were going up or the debt ceiling needed to be raised. And we did have some constructive bipartisan negotiations. But the president, if you look back at his 8 years, the pattern is very clear. The first 2 years, he had total control of Congress. He could do anything he wanted to, and he did. $1 trillion stimulus, Obamacare, Dodd-Frank. Then the American people issued a national restraining order and flipped the House in 2010. And so he was out of business legislatively. And so that was the moment at which we would find out whether he was either Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. Divided government is actually the best time to do tough stuff. Think of Reagan and Tip O'Neill raising the age for Social Security, doing the last comprehensive tax reform. Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress doing welfare reform and actually balancing the budget 3 years in a row. But the CEO of the country has to go to the political center in that divided government situations to make that happen. Barack Obama had 3 times to do a Clintonian flip after 2010, after 2012, and after 2014. Instead, as I think we all know, he's doubled down on the regulatory side and pursued his agenda that way. So he made a conscious decision not to be a centrist. I mean, you know, he's a very smart guy. He knows what he's doing. He wanted to move the country to the left, and he has.
So I could talk to you all day. And there's so much, I highly recommend this book. There's so much in it. There's the story of you seeking to become the majority leader of your party, which of course, then it's the minority leader. You had a heart attack.
No, I didn't actually. No.
Triple bypass surgery?
I did, but I didn't have a heart attack. We caught it beforehand. It would have been a lot worse if I'd had a heart attack. So I didn't, but I needed some plumbing repair, let's put it that way.
You won your first race with Roger Ailes as your media consultant, and you were down by 35 points in July?
In July.
So we could get into all that, but because we're in a truncated schedule and we want to take questions from the audience, I want to see if we could do somewhat of a lightning round.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to ask you names. You can give me short answers, and we'll have some fun. Just what's your take on this person? And I'll start with Muhammad Ali.
The greatest.
Harry Reid.
Rhetorically challenged.
You already talked about John Sherman Cooper. Jim DeMint.
It doesn't play well with others.
Vin Scully.
Oh, my goodness. Vin Scully, I think this is finally his last year at 90-something. He'd been around so long, I remember listening to him on the radio when I listened to the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 50s. An American icon.
Matt Bevin.
A guy who bounced back from a pretty good drubbing that I gave him in the primary and didn't quit and became governor of Kentucky the next year.
It's a good lesson in perseverance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rand Paul.
Really creative, interesting, libertarian. No, we need a libertarian faction in the Republican Party. And I admire the fact that Rand plays within the tent rather than going off on his own. And he's a good colleague.
Henry Clay.
The great compromiser. Yeah, I mean, who more than any other person, I think, held the country together as long as it could hold together before the Civil War with the great compromises that dealt with the expansion of our country all the way to the Pacific.
The other great compromiser, Ted Cruz.
No comment.
John McCain.
American hero. Boy, he's, you know, we've been at war with each other at times on issues and great allies on others. Really a remarkable human being.
Yeah. Talk, if you would, real quick about McCain Feingold. You've been a champion and a leader of free speech and political speech. And the fact that George W. Bush signed McCain Feingold after running against it must have been very difficult.
It was not a high point for me. What he's talking about is the campaign finance war is a kind of arcane subject that only a handful of us are interested in, but it has everything to do with the First Amendment and political speech and how much the government is going to micromanage how we participate in the political process. And I've always, been for minimal government restrictions on how we choose to participate, who we support, how we engage on issues. The Democrats these days are the party of government. They want government to control everything, including how you participate in the political process. John got off on one of those issues, and it became very important to him. We fought it all to a draw, I thought, and then it ended up passing with a Republican House, a Republican Senate, Republican President. I was the plaintiff against the case and lost in the Supreme Court. So I called McCain up and I said, congratulations, you won and I lost.
All right, back to the lightning round. I'll lump these guys together. Matt Drudge, Rush Limbaugh.
Big audiences.
Hillary Clinton.
I think a pretty flawed candidate, but certainly intelligent and knowledgeable. And it'll be interesting to see which direction the country wants to go. This is not a short answer, but I think if people are comfortable with the last 8 years, a vote for Hillary Clinton is 4 more years, just like the last 8.
All right. I want to take some questions. Senator McConnell, thank you. Let's go to this great young gentleman right here, who works with me at the Daily Caller.
Senator, thank you very much. Jaime Weinstein from the Daily Caller. My question to you is, we've seen Donald Trump do a whole sorts of things that have embarrassed the Republican Party, including recently with his recent comments that many consider racist about the judge that is overseeing his Trump University case. My question to you is there anything that Trump could do or say that would make you reconsider your endorsement of him? And if so, what exactly would that be?
Well, I think a good place to start would be to apologize for the various totally inappropriate things he said over the last couple of weeks. Another thing I'd like to see him do is get on script. You'd be interested in a story. I was with him in the green room when he went to the NRA convention in Louisville a couple of weeks ago. And I said, hey, Donald, have you got a script? Pulled it out of his pocket. I said, are you going to use it? He said, I hate the script. It's boring. I said, put me down in favor of boring. Put me down in favor of boring. I think it's time for him to look like a serious candidate for president, which means that you need to think before you speak. You need to apologize when you make a mistake and get on script. He's running for the most important job in the country, some would argue in the world. And I think there's a certain threshold of credibility that needs to be met. This could be a winnable race. Americans do, I think, want something different. That's why he got the nomination. But I think it's time for him to start acting like a serious presidential candidate.
Senator, if I could just clarify, because I don't...
I heard what your question was, but that's what I intend to say.
You want to go right there?
Hi, Derek Hunter, Daily Caller, Town Hall, and WBAL Radio.
I did not set that up.
Yeah, the check's in the mail, Matt. You mentioned the regulatory state that the Obama administration has exploded in the bypassing of Congress. And I agree with you, the president has overstepped his bounds. But how much of that blame can be laid at the feet of Congress for writing vague laws that empower the regulatory state?
I think part of it is Congress' fault. I mean, Obamacare was basically a blank check. Go out there and do whatever you want to. Now, people like me didn't vote for it. In fact, not a single Republican did. But much of the regulatory assault is not a result of anything that was passed the first 2 years. at EPA, at the NLRB, at the FCC, you name the agency. I mean, there's a regulatory rampage going on across the country on purpose. Their view is if you're making a profit, you must be up to no good. And so, you know, they're here to modify your behavior. And that is the single biggest reason why we've had this tepid growth rate and why we've got the worst recovery after a deep recession since World War II. So, yeah, I think in the case of financial services and healthcare, where there were two big new pieces of legislation, the Democrats who voted for it and had the votes to pass it basically gave a blank check to the regulators.
Even further back than that, back to the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and
Well,
over time,
regardless of
you write vague laws that say as a matter to be determined by the secretary and leave it up to somebody else. Well, those secretaries that might have been on your team when the law was passed, but they change, and then they find ways to expand rather than writing very specific laws.
Okay. Yeah. Regardless of whose fault it is, it needs to stop. I mean, it doesn't make any difference whose fault it is at this point. If you like slow growth and you like lack of opportunity, you keep on doing this kind of stuff. So, you know, what needs to happen is we need to take our foot off the brake and put it on the accelerator. With not 1/4 3% growth in 7 years. Look at the last jobs report. Look at the last quarter growth. Regardless of whose fault it is, it needs to stop. And it will not stop under the party of government. I mean, if you're looking for a definition of the two parties today, the Democrats are the party of the government, we're the party of the private sector. Obviously, we need both. The question is, how much of each? And this has been a huge expansion of government in every way. Spending, taxes, overregulation. Oh, they love litigation, too. Every time they can create a new opportunity to file a lawsuit, they do. You add all that up, and you get the kind of tepid growth that we've been experiencing here the last few years.
Okay, let's go back there.
I'm Phil Wegman with the Daily Signal. And Senator, you've talked at length about compromise, but some conservatives complain that the Senate hasn't done enough to push Democrats in the White House towards the center. In particular, they complain about writing appropriations bills to 1070 and also, you know, avoiding fights on controversial policy writers. Are they being unrealistic in their expectations during an election year?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure which one of those you want me to tackle. With regard to appropriations, here's the choice. You either pass each individual appropriation bill or you pass an omnibus, which gives the president all the power and the ability to argue that somehow we're shutting down the government if we don't go along with him. Unfortunately, my party owns the government shutdown brand. It's not a good brand. There's no way, after having tried that gambit in the 90s and having tried it again in 2013, you can convince the public that it's the president's fault. We blew that one big time. So the only logical response is to try to pass each appropriation bill individually, which is what we're endeavoring to do this year. It's boring stuff. It never makes a headline in the New York Times, but it's the basic work of government, and we ought to pass each one of them. With regard to riders, last year we had lots of riders on them, but we couldn't get them through the Senate. It gets back to the point I made earlier that I think bears repeating, which is that there's only one person in America who can sign something into law. And so he has a lot of leverage in these legislative battles.
You've mentioned the shutdown a couple times, so I want to ask you, there's a candidate who ran for president as a consummate outsider. A lot of people think that at certain points he has crossed the line, including on the Senate floor. Is there a chance that Senator Ted Cruz, now coming back to the Senate, becomes a team player? And how do you see that working out in the future?
Well, you'll have to ask him that. Yeah.
Well, let's say he calls you. Can he call? Let's say that he needs something done in Texas. There's a flood. Are the lines of communication open? He can pick up the phone and call your office?
Well, sure. We all talk. Yeah.
Okay. Is there another question? Right there.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name is Patrick Enright, veteran. My question is, what is your position on spending huge amounts of money keeping American forces overseas, trying to build and rebuild countries that haven't been able to build themselves in 5 millennia?
Yeah, it depends on the country and how big a threat they are to us. In the case of Afghanistan, I don't have to tell you what the threat was. And I think the overwhelming feeling was that if we didn't do something about it, that would continue. It is very, very difficult, no question, to sort of settle down a country with no tradition of the rule of law. But it was the launching pad for the 9/11 attack and for a lot of other things that are not good. And so you can either take a passive approach to it, or you can take the problem, go after the problem directly. In the case of Iraq, at the time when everybody thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and we knew he had previously had them because he used them, there were only 23 votes in the Senate against doing that. Now, when it started going south, everybody backed up. But these are huge challenges, and I think you have to look at it on a country-by-country basis. And sort of a blanket statement about when you do and you don't intervene, I think the world doesn't neatly fall into those categories. But let me just say this about the president's foreign policy in general. I'll quote Jimmy Carter, who, when asked a year ago to sum up Barack Obama's foreign policy, he said he couldn't think of a single place in the world where we were better off now than we were when Obama came to office. Not one. So we've tried the apology tour. You remember the speech in Cairo in 2009 in which the president tended to question American exceptionalism and say if we just all talked together, things would be better. We watched the Iran deal. We watched the invasion of the taking of Crimea, the invasion of eastern Ukraine. And for me, as this proud son of a World War II veteran, it really grated on me to see the president go to Hiroshima. It doesn't make any difference that he didn't apologize. There's only one reason to make a speech in Hiroshima. So let me go back to my book a minute. Got a letter from my dad to my mother, VE Day, May the 8th, 1945. They met the Russians in Pilsen, which is in the Czech Republic. He comes home, he has orders to go to the Pacific. They were issued what's called jungle equipment. It's estimated it'll cost 1 million American lives to take the mainland of Japan because the Japanese have been fighting to the death in every one of those islands across the Pacific. Truman's decision to drop the bomb was pretty damn popular at our house, and I think it was popular all across America. There's nothing to apologize for. So, I don't think America in retreat, not just the failure to use troops, which I'm not suggesting is always the best solution, but America lowering its profile is good for us or good for the world, because the vacuum will be filled by somebody else, the Russians, the Chinese, who?
Senator, we're almost out of time. I think we have time for one more question. And then we're going to go, and you're going to sign some books. And the way to do that is to line up in the center aisle here, line up, and he's going to sign some books. Let's go right there for the last question.
Hi, my name is Barbara Delo, and I'm not a journalist active now. My ears perked up when you spoke about your mom taking care of you after you were sick, because I was a parent of a child with very serious health problems, and now I'm a home caretaker for my dad. It can be an enormous job, exhausting, and even caretakers need some sleep and hands-on help. Yet my experience coming and advocating for healthcare policy in D.C. is that it's focused on economics and the cost of caring for costly patients. As leader of the Senate, are you committed to protecting all Americans, even the frail and elderly? And can we succeed in doing so?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, I'll put it to you this way. Republicans obviously oppose Obamacare.
Yeah.
But what good public policy should we be supporting that would help take care of sick people, of elderly people, people who need help?
Well, it's a heck of a challenge. I mean, as healthcare improves for all of us, we live longer and longer. And anytime you have a family member who has serious problems, whether it's aging or whether it's younger, it's a huge challenge. And I don't know the solution to all of that. I know the government can't afford to provide the level of care that everyone would like. But we have an enormous safety net already for elderly people and for disabled people and others. This is a very compassionate society. Whether that's enough to deal with your particular problem, I don't know. But I think it's some of these challenges are huge. I'm not sure the government can afford to take care of every one of these challenges that we may have.
I think we have 1 minute left, and I wanted to ask you a final question to talk about your wife, because that's a part that's in the book that's obviously hugely important. Talk about how she's impacted your life and sort of how you all met.
Well, my wife, Elaine Chao, as some of you may know, was Secretary of Labor in the Bush administration. Talk about an interesting early life. Her mother and father lived in mainland China. They dodged the Japanese invasion. And then a little bit later, they were running from the communist takeover, ended up in Taiwan separately. And my father had met her briefly on the mainland. He looked for her for 2 years on Taiwan. They got married, had 3 daughters, but he wanted to have a better life. So he came to America and worked 3 years over here, multiple jobs, trying to get a start in the shipping business. And then he called for my mother-in-law, my late mother-in-law, and the daughters to come over. They couldn't afford an airline ticket, so they came over in a freighter, big old bulk commodity freighter. The crew, Elaine's mom and 2 sisters, went into an apartment in Queens, not speaking a word of English. Classic American first-generation success story. Ended up having 6 daughters, 4 of whom graduated from Harvard Business School. 1 slackered as a lawyer.
My favorite story is when they're in the apartment in Queens and Halloween trick-or-treaters come knocking on the door.
Yeah, their first Halloween. They thought they were being robbed. Had no idea what it was about. And so, imagine going to a strange country, not knowing the language and all the rest. But it just, points out again what a great country this is and why we never want to shut down legal immigration. Legal immigration is absolutely essential. And all of us, some of us sooner than others, just about all of us are the descendants of somebody who had enough guts to get up from wherever they were in the world and go to America for a chance to succeed. And that kind of renewal process we need to never move away from.
Indeed. It's a great book. You can line up right here in the center aisle to get them signed. Majority Leader McConnell. Thank you, sir.
Senator, Judge Great, I brought my interns and clerks for a picture. We